Hello again, Dan Alasso, making history. It is day 14 of my retrenchment odyssey, meaning I have 267 days left to work at Bemidji State. And today I want to tell you a little bit about the meeting that I went to where the deans rolled out their reorganization plan. But first, I want to set the scene a little bit. I generally kind of dislike and mistrust arguments that suggest that academia needs to try to be more like business. To a great extent, I suspect that my distrust comes from spending 20 years in business, including actually also a bit of time in business school, seeing what they teach there. I took some courses, including the undergraduate capstone in the management program at the University of Minnesota in, I suppose it was the early 90s. I was a bit impressed, I have to say, by Michael Porter's case studies, which were all the rage at the time, which always seemed to kind of illustrate some interesting insight that he wanted to focus on. I always suspected, however, that there might be more going on than Porter's narratives highlighted, but at least they were inspiring stories. But even so, I didn't really see a lot of evidence of even that level of thinking in my actual experience working in businesses, either in the securities and insurance industries that I started out in, or in high tech, where I spent most of the 2 decades that I worked. There was lots of ego, there was lots of Kool-Aid drinking, there was lots of wishful thinking. Occasionally, a manager or an executive was humble enough to try to really understand what their customers preferred and what the market was telling them. These people were generally ones that had a lot of skin in the game, usually in small startups that were at risk of disappearing if they failed. Those types of people are usually obsessed with understanding exactly what their customers want and then developing and articulating a value proposition. I rarely saw highly compensated managers or executives who didn't have that kind of stake in the outcome ever second guess a decision or a strategy, especially not once they had publicly committed to it. So if you're sensing that I'm about to segue back to higher ed, you're not wrong. As much as fans of academia might object, today's colleges and universities are run like businesses. They're not citizen-owned. They're not even really government-owned entities that are operated solely in the public interest using public expenditures. Even quote-unquote public institutions, like those in the Minnesota state system, are expected to pay their way. While they may receive substantial funding and grants from the government, at the end of the year, they are expected to balance their books. Deficits created by spending more than they take in are not covered. No one says, well, you were doing what we asked, you were doing the right things, but enrollment is down, so here's a check to make you whole. Of course, one could, and I have, argued that BSU has not been doing the right things. This is one of the ironies of our current situation. The university is expected to operate like a business, but we don't really seem to want to put business people in charge of business tasks and decisions. Our executives are sort of hybrids. Oftentimes they are semi-successful academics who at some point in their careers decided to move into administration without really demonstrating that they were really adequately prepared. Being a somewhat remote northern Minnesota campus probably adds a little bit to the difficulty for BSU, since it's hard to attract candidates and since we like to try to promote from within our community. But this is not always the case. We ran a national search for our new president. He presented himself, and the announcement of his appointment presented him as an expert on educational leadership with both a PhD and teaching experience in the subject. The chancellor, in his announcement, touted this new president's devotion to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and his success as a fundraiser. Now, these are qualities that would be very helpful at BSU. Unfortunately, in the present crisis, these attributes are beginning to seem a little bit more like frosting rather than cake. And if there's no cake, there's nothing to frost. My biggest issue, as I mentioned yesterday, is that it was the 3 deans and not the upper level administration that worked all summer, worked for 8 weeks or more to try to come up with this plan to reorganize the university to be more sustainable and maybe even to grow. The deans are the actual hybrids. They are half academic and half administrator. At many schools, they even sometimes teach. The administrators above them are the ones who are supposed to be able to run the business of the university. And so far, the only contribution that they've made is their plan to retrench 27 faculty and cut our way to profitability. So what happened at the dean's meeting? Well, it began with a request for the current department chairs to celebrate achievements in the previous spring semester or over the summer. And this was a little bit painful. Most of them had to do with someone receiving a big grant. Then the deans named and congratulated all the faculty who had received tenure or promotion. At least one of these people that they were congratulating was not only receiving tenure and promotion, but also being retrenched. Then came the justification for the reorganization, and incidentally, for the retrenchment that preceded it. The provost showed some slides that suggested that spending in academic affairs had increased 15% for instruction. And this is a problem. A bigger problem that went kind of unaddressed was that non-instructional academic affairs spending had increased 35%. So maybe instead of cutting quite so many faculty, we maybe ought to be asking the provost to reduce his non-instructional spending a bit, maybe even to give back some of that money. And then the dean's proposal was to reduce from 3 colleges to 2, incidentally eliminating 1 dean, and to reorganize 22 departments into 7 of what they're going to call schools. And this would save about 90 credits of reassigned time and hundreds of duty days, since department chairs get a 6-credit annual release and 28 duty days to do that job. And we'd be reducing 15 chairs. And it might create synergies and interesting interdisciplinary opportunities. The deans also mentioned it would reduce some redundancy. And reducing redundancy seemed to be something that they were pitching to the upper management. I'm not 100% convinced of that, because some of the courses I teach, like decolonization and women in history and history of world religions, are similar and are more or less duplicated by courses in other programs that won't become part of my school. Of course, that's just an example. This doesn't apply to me at all, since I won't be there, so it's not my problem. And maybe that's my final takeaway from this meeting. When I looked around the room, I saw a lot of set jaws and stony expressions, and during the Q&A, there was a fair amount of negativity. Even from, and maybe even particularly from, people who are not getting retrenched. I came away from the meeting thinking that resistance, and especially passive resistance, might be the thing that kills this plan. If that's the case, there really isn't much hope. The deans said at the beginning of their presentation that the upper management has tasked them with reducing their budget for academic year 2025-26 by $4 to $5 million. If things don't change and they have to default to management's solution of cutting faculty, that's going to mean over 40 people. And there will only be 141 people left after the current retrenchment. So there's another meeting about this on Thursday, and I will attend that, I suppose, even if only out of curiosity, and report what I discover there. But that's all for now, so I hope you found that a little bit interesting. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you again.